Yeah. Why do you go? Go in the middle. Thank you for going silent. A very good evening to you. Welcome to the LSE. If you're not normally here, as I would say, if you are normally here, good to see you as well. This is a European Institute School of Public Policy public event, and it's going to consider the book here, published by Stefaan De Rynck, called Inside the Deal: How the EU Got Brexit Done. I'm sure the choosing of that title must have given the publishers some pleasure. I should say first, my name's Tony Travers. I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Public Policy and a Professor in the Government Department. And I'm very happy to welcome Stefaan De Rynck and our long-term friend Vicky Price, an alumna of the school, to the LSE today. And I welcome all of you, of course. Now, what's the event about? Well, the event, of course, is, as so much still is in Britain today, about Brexit and its aftermath. But Stefaan De Rynck was a close aide to Michel Barnier, who, as you will all know, was the chief negotiator from the EU side of the Brexit deal. And therefore, Stefaan, as his chief of staff, close aide to Michel Barnier, had a ringside seat in the Brexit negotiations. And in the book, which we're about to hear from him about, he's going to discuss the way the EU approached this issue and the way the UK responded, how the deal was done, how the European Commission and the European Union held the line, a rules-based institution dealing with the UK government, which I think it's fair to say went into the negotiations with perhaps a less clear idea than when they came out, but we'll see. For those who are using Twitter, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Brexit. I'd like you to put your phones on silent if you haven't already. The event is being recorded, and so if you do want to ask a question, there'll be an opportunity to do that soon. Just know that it's going to be recorded. There'll be an opportunity for Q&A, including for those who are watching or listening, I should say, online, so you too can have a question answered as well. That's it, really. So I just say a little bit more about our two guests. Stefaan De Rynck is currently head of the European Commission's representation in Belgium and is a visiting professor at the University of Leiden, having previously worked as senior advisor, as I said earlier, to Michel Barnier, who was the European Union's chief negotiator for Brexit. Vicky Price is chief economic advisor for the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Many of you will, or some of you may have been here when she launched her own book not long ago called Women versus Capitalism: Why We can't have it all in a free market economy. And indeed, Vicky will be back next month to launch a new book about economics, but she can say a word about that later. That's on the 7th of March. So enough from me. This issue remains highly topical, both in the EU and in the United Kingdom. The question of not only how Brexit happened and how the deal was done, but how it continues to unfold in the UK and across Europe, and indeed beyond that as well. The book will be available if you want a copy to buy it afterwards, and Stefaan De Rynck has kindly agreed to stay on the stage here to sign it for those of you who would like a signed copy. But we'll just begin the evening with a presentation from Stefaan De Rynck. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Featherstone. Thank you also for giving me the honor of speaking at the London School of Economics. And thank you, Vicky, for accepting to be a discussant. I'm speaking tonight in my capacity as author of this book, Inside the Deal, and how the EU got Brexit done. And I'm not speaking in my capacity as an EU official. So the book came out a week ago. It covers the period 2016, the June referendum, until early 2021, or until Christmas Day 2020, when we basically presented, or Michel Barnier on Christmas Day presented a draft trade and cooperation agreement to the 27 ambassadors of EU member states in Brussels. So I do not speak as an EU official, I speak as an author, but having pronounced those caveats, I think you will, or you may want to agree with me that the period since June 16 till early 21 gives us sufficient material for a conversation tonight. So a week ago, it was 3 years since the UK left the European Union, and the decision by UK to take back control of its sovereignty rather than pool that sovereignty with other EU member states and with EU institutions was, of course, a momentous one, with many ratifications to this day, and particularly in the UK, where the topic is certainly more topical, I would say, than in the EU member states. Now, it will not surprise you that I see pooling sovereignty in the EU as a political act that makes a country stronger and more influential. Certainly, it makes relationships between neighbors, between neighboring member states, easier by organizing free movement of people, by organizing frictionless economic exchanges within a common institutional framework. And that's certainly an important point for the relationships between Ireland and the United Kingdom. So it's not just a point about labor markets and economic efficiency, trade and the export of goods. More generally, the EU is a political system searching for a consensus between member states in light of common policy challenges or in light of a need to respond to shocks such as the pandemic or the Russian war in Ukraine today. And as an EU member state, one is part of that constant deliberation to search for that consensus and to search for what I would argue are ultimately construction of the common good for the European continent. And a country that puts itself outside of that club puts itself, of course, in a different position. It puts itself in a situation where it meets a European Union that negotiates in its own interests, which is a very different situation, which is what we always meant when we said the UK is now a third country, or has decided to become a third country. But statements by some British politicians, or at least based on their public statements during negotiations, seem to somehow express surprise at times that the UK had to bargain with the EU from the outside, rather than continue to influence the EU from the inside. And that's certainly something that I discuss also in this book. Now, the focus of the book is the Brexit story seen from Brussels or told from Brussels. And it's a very different tale from the Brexit story told in London. The book discusses the unity of the 27 governments and the EU institutions as its main strength during these negotiations. And I have a number of factors which I summarize or want to summarize here by way of introduction of our conversation on how to explain that unity of 27 governments, European Parliament and European Commission during the Brexit negotiations. And the first one for me would be the primary factor, which was that unity emerged from a sense of high political responsibility of EU leaders. By that I mean national governments, national prime ministers, people like the German Chancellor, the French President, the Dutch Minister President, and other leaders in the European Council. Because in 2016, the EU came out of many crises. The euro crisis had been incredibly divisive. Brexit was the issue of the day in July 2015, but luckily avoided. Migration was a very divisive crisis between member states. And those national government leaders, what I call EU leaders, many of whom were also confronted with anti-EU or Eurosceptic parties in their domestic public debates, saw in Brexit yet another risk for an existential challenge to the European Union and wanted to avoid that. And people like Matteo Salvini in Italy, as I quote in a book, said after the referendum, Italy should not be the last country to leave the sinking ship. So this led certainly to a very firm stand on the side of the EU that membership had to matter, and that a country that was a member of the EU obviously had more benefits than a country that decided to leave. Beyond that sense of political responsibility I described in the book, especially in the early chapters, the co-construction of a negotiation mandate between us in the Commission and the 27 governments, also with the support of the European Parliament. It was a co-creation, and that is not the usual way sometimes that the EU institutions work. There was a lot of going back and forth interaction between officials in the Council, officials in the Commission, national diplomats, to co-create that mandate, which led in April 2017, a third factor for me in terms of unity, a very crystal clear negotiation mandate. General, but based on very clear principles, notably the integrity of the single market, safeguarding the autonomy of EU decision-making without the UK, post-Brexit, and a number of other principles. And it's interesting to note, in my view, that this is also a trade-off, because people realized that the UK leaving the EU would be a short-term cost for the European Union. But the choice was made to safeguard the internal market, to safeguard the autonomy of EU decision-making, and to create those clear principles, because medium, longer term, without those principles, the cost would have been higher. The Commission's transparency and inclusive method of working with 27 governments and the European Parliament certainly supported also the unity throughout these talks. It was there. We practiced that method from the start. In the book, I describe how Michel Barnier, in October 16, first weeks in office, went to see the Dutch government, the Romanian government, the Irish government. I think he saw the French president also in that first few hectic weeks of traveling, basically, and go around and see prime ministers and co-construct that mandate that then came forward in April 2017. There are a few pictures in the book. So, oh. It's the end of the slideshow.
Help will be at hand. I promise you, help is at hand.
I wanted to show 4 pictures to
Don't worry.
give you a bit of feel. There are 21 pictures in the book from my iPhone mostly. And the first one is of Michel Barnier talking to the German Chancellor. Great. And so that's an illustration of what I just said, that symbiotic relationship between EU leaders and Michel Barnier to construct that mandate. Here he's talking to Theresa May, to Angela Merkel, about the first 3 topics that had to be dealt with: citizens' rights, Northern Ireland, and the financial settlement. This is a picture from later, but this is most of the Dutch government, with Michel Barnier explaining with his deputy negotiator to most of the Dutch government ministers attending, with Mark Rutte on the other side, the minister-president of the Netherlands. This picture is not in the book, by the way. The other 3 are part of the book. So before moving on, let me just remind ourselves, as I say, I look at this issue from the perspective of the EU, but the UK went through a very difficult political period in those same months. While this was going on in the EU, the co-creation of the mandate, the first months of the referendum here were characterized by, can the government notify? Should Parliament agree to notification? media, certain media spoke about enemies of the people. Betrayal was part of what some media also advertised in terms of how the country or how some in the UK were allegedly dealing with this Brexit, with this departure from the European Union. So it was a very different atmosphere, of course, here compared to what was happening on the EU side. And Theresa May then also called elections after notifying, not before notifying, expecting that she would win a comfortable majority and, in her words, make a success of Brexit, which of course also did not happen. And that's also a key factor that runs throughout the book, how we from our side had to deal with a difficult political situation for the UK government as well. By the way, many people back then thought in Brussels they must be uncorking the champagne, our government is weaker, has been denied the majority by the voter. The opposite was actually true, I argue in the book. And we had actually wished for a strong government majority for either party to be able to negotiate with a strong partner on this crucial issue. My final point on the unity comes back to the negotiations and the sequencing of the talks. I just showed Barnier's 3 points with Angela Merkel. We avoided talks on the future relationship and focused on the divorce settlements. And the important point there for me was that the EU team managed to deliver on what member states wanted for citizens' rights, mostly 90%, with exception of some family reunion rights and some other issues. The financial settlement we managed to deliver. And that created certainly a high amount of trust from the 27 governments and from these 27 diplomats in the European Commission as a negotiator. The unity was already crucial at that point during the divorce negotiations, and even more in 2018 during a volatile British political situation, for us to practice patience in these negotiations. Without such unity, patience would have been certainly much more difficult. And I think patience from our side for the UK to make up its mind on what it wanted, or patience to avoid that the UK would impose part of the economic cost of Brexit on us in the EU, were certainly important factors for us. And maybe before moving on, let me make one more point on this, because the unity of 27 governments gave us, of course, a more comfortable position than UK negotiators, at least until December 19, when Boris Johnson won then a decisive majority in the elections. Because UK negotiators had a divided parliament on whose behalf they were negotiating. And I think those structural political differences are important and probably too easily forgotten by people who criticize UK negotiators. Let me move to a different point. In the book, I state, to the surprise perhaps of some, that for us it was easier to negotiate the future relationship with Boris Johnson in 2020 than with Theresa May in 2018. And one could perhaps attribute this to Johnson's majority in Westminster, or to the fact that by that time in 2020, Brexit was done, an issue Brexit was not done, which certainly plagued Theresa May and her negotiation approach. But I look at the story from Brussels, however, and looked at from Brussels, I argue that the fundamental reason why negotiations with Boris Johnson and his team, David Frost, was easier, because they accepted that leaving the single market and leaving the customs union would lead to trade obstacles that did not exist between EU members. And this was something that Theresa May did not want to accept, and she wanted to change basically our mandate, which said if you leave the single market and the customs union, inevitably there is friction to trade because you don't accept the same obligations as an EU member. Now, we had difficult discussions with Boris Johnson, to be clear, and David Frost, his negotiator, in particular on the level playing field. David Frost initially contested that a minimal free trade agreement would have to include level playing field commitments and robust safeguards for the level playing field. Because in his words, as a sovereign equal of UK-EU, those issues did not have their place in such a free trade agreement. My book has a specific chapter on the level playing field that explains that it would have been impossible from our side to negotiate any free trade agreement without having robust safeguards to the level playing field. Indeed, the first conversation I document in the book for Barnier with one of the government leaders, Mark Rutte, and it was clear from October 16 that the level playing field was a deal breaker for many national governments. So that was clear for us already in the first months after the referendum. But the discussions with Frost and Johnson were somewhat easier because they accepted that paradigm that underlied our mandate of having a free trade agreement, and therefore inevitable friction that did not exist between EU members. In those difficult discussions on level playing field and also on fisheries with Johnson's government, there was often a confrontational rhetoric, somewhat echoing May's approach before negotiations started, the Lancaster House speech, January 17, no deal better than a bad deal. That rhetoric certainly also came back in 2020, when Boris Johnson frequently threatened to walk away from the negotiations. And I document in the book two things: how that no-deal threats galvanized the unity of the EU, and also how it did not have any material impact on us as negotiators. Because I say in the book that negotiations are not about trying to crush an opponent or sway an opponent into different mandates or into different things that the opponent, or the other party, I should say, rather than opponent in negotiations, asks for. I argue that a party in negotiation gains influence by offering something of value to the other party, rather than by constantly rejecting what the other party wants or what the other party says it absolutely needs to conclude an agreement. Before concluding, let me discuss one example of a negotiation episode, which I found particularly revealing for many aspects I discussed so far, and which underscored that point that Brexit in London was seen very differently from Brexit in Brussels. In November 2018, we concluded a deal, an agreement with Theresa May and her government. It was a very difficult period for the government. David Davis had resigned a few months earlier. Boris Johnson, as Foreign Secretary, had resigned. Dominic Raab, the Brexit Secretary, would resign that night over the agreement by the government to the agreement we had negotiated. A softer Brexit than what Theresa May had originally announced in her early speeches. And we were waiting in Brussels for Dominic Raab to come for a press conference. A bit hesitating to push. Oh. Just a picture of us at the press conference, which was then a solo press conference Michel Barnier gave in the end, after Theresa May had spoken here in Downing Street to announce the agreement. This is us, part of the core negotiating team, looking on Twitter what the people behind us tweet about what Barnier says on the podium. Which is, we all like that picture, so it's in the book. So, but to come back to the story was a few days after we emerged from that famous tunnel, which is that dark space where negotiators shielded us from transparency, our usual transparency with national diplomats. Were negotiating with Theresa May's team, notably on Northern Ireland, avoiding the hard border, which had been dominating the discussions. And the book shows that when Barnier's team presented that deal, that agreement, to the 27 ambassadors, there were many questions whether that could, how that would work. There was some hesitancy. And the agreement was that the UK would stay as a whole in the customs union with the EU unless and until another solution was found for Northern Ireland. I describe how a Dutch journalist in a technical briefing to Barnier's deputy, who sits on the left here, asked if member states would be able to agree to such a soft cushion for Brexit in Britain. And a few weeks earlier, 8 ministers of fishery had met to discuss their concerns about what Barnier was doing, and notably that concern that the fishery member states would give up some influence in future negotiations by agreeing to the backstop as it emerged then eventually with Theresa May's team. And we as a negotiating team took a calculated risk using political capital that we thought we had, and indeed we had, with member states to make sure this deal was accepted. And it was accepted because it had stringent level playing field conditions attached to it, which Theresa May also never contested. On the contrary, she always said that the UK was a champion also on state aid, competition policy, and high standards, and therefore could easily accept that. The reaction in Westminster was somewhat different. Some MPs who were more on the Remain side rejected the agreement because they wanted a second referendum before any agreement would come into place. And people on the Brexit side of the argument argued that the EU had trapped the UK in its rules, in its customs, in its trade policy without a say and without the capacity to strike its own trade deals. Ultimately, that's a fundamentally different view of seeing the world, but what Theresa May saw as benefits, some of her MPs in her party saw as disadvantages. But we in Brussels had to work to make sure that this deal went through. To make a long story short, further divisions emerged in Westminster, as you know. UK voters came to the rescue to end the paralysis in December 19. And in Boris Johnson's word, Bob was your uncle, I think is what I quote also in the book, and there with the revised protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. I have one picture in the book, and I conclude after that, which was taken exactly when the tellers announced in March 2019 the results of the second meaningful vote. And I would like you to look at the faces of my colleagues across the table. It's 10 o'clock in the evening. We had some red wine, so you will see some empty glasses. And I insist it's 10 o'clock in the evening we are looking at. And look at it in light of the accusation that people like Dominic Cummings, allegation at least, said months later when Boris Johnson was in power, that the EU team was trying to sabotage Brexit. We were looking at, if you see the two ladies on the left, on the right, from your perspective, the despondency or the despair on these faces for me tells 1,000 words in terms of how we had wished that the deal would have gotten through and Brexit got done, basically. Anyhow, we are now in 2023, so let me conclude. On the EU side, if you look back now at 2017 and our initial fears, one initial fear did certainly not materialize, which was that how will the loss of a net contributor, 10 billion a year, to the EU budget be absorbed? Will this lead to haggling between national treasuries? Today, we have next generation EU and an 800 billion borrowing capacity, dwarfing the 10 billion net contribution of the UK at the time. The result of a tiny virus with a big effect. And there is more unity, I would say, today in the EU than there was pre-2016. If you look at how it approached the pandemic or how it reacts now to the Russian war in Ukraine. I wrote this book because I would hope that I'm respectful of the UK in this book, respectful also of negotiators who had to work in very difficult circumstances. And I hope that by explaining the logic of the EU, we can come to a better common understanding of what happened in that period, looking back. And I think looking back is important in terms of going forwards, and hopefully a better common understanding and the understanding of the logic of the European Union, how it negotiated, can also be helpful for a more constructive relationship going forwards from here onwards. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we're going to hear a response from Vicky Price, who, in addition, as I said, I should have said this earlier, to her current role, of course, was once the head of the government's economic service and chief economist at what is today the business department.
Thank you. Thank you very much for taking us through what the book says. And you and I discussed it just a little bit before so that I know what to focus on. It's really interesting when you look at the UK's response or thoughts about the whole process by comparison to where you came from. And I think there was huge misunderstanding in terms of the power balance between the UK and Europe. And I think there was a belief that Europe couldn't do without us, but obviously it can. And also it was obvious to anyone who was watching it from here, particularly with a little bit of European background, which I have got, being Greek and having, of course, seen how Europe dealt with Greece, that Britain didn't stand a chance. And it's exactly what happened at the end of the day. But I think it's quite interesting to just go through some of what you have in the book, because it looks like what we've got here in the UK is a bit of a Brexit curse. If you just look at what's happened to all our prime ministers, I mean, Cameron had to resign. May took over when no one else wanted to have that job, because I think everyone knew that it was an impossible job to do. And indeed, it proved impossible for her. Then we had Johnson. Well, he's no longer there. We then briefly had Truss. Now we have Rishi Sunak. Most of those people that are mentioned voted, or half of them voted to leave, half of them voted remain. But it doesn't matter what you voted. If you were a politician, you really had a pretty bad time. And I think it did reflect the history of the UK's views on Europe. And I'm going to quote from your book, which does say quite clearly that the UK has had a history of being basically an awkward EU partner and member. So Margaret Thatcher, as you've got here, got a UK tailored rebate from the budget. So she managed to get that, which is something, but of course she made herself pretty objectionable during that period. John Major's main EU achievement was to obtain opt-outs in Maastricht. So again, sort of rowing back a little bit of whatever was going on in the EU. Gordon Brown signed the Treaty of Lisbon by himself, skipping the ceremony with all the other EU leaders, just thought he didn't want to be contaminated by doing it right next to them. He just signed it on the sideline. Well, David Cameron, one of the few prime ministers who did not attend the award of the 2012 Nobel Peace Prize to the EU, took the Conservative Party out of the influential European People's Party. And that was a big, big, big mistake at the time. And the EU and the UK hardly agreed on the meaning of EU membership. So we wanted to just be in, but be out at the same time, which I think is more or less where we were. So it's not really a surprise the way in which they interpreted the meaning of the Leave vote differently. Well, but how did they interpret the Leave vote? You do mention that Theresa May didn't quite know what this was all about, or what she thought Brexit would look like. So she came up with Brexit means Brexit, which was really interesting. I don't know if you remember at the time, I live in Lambeth, which voted, it was probably, it was the highest voting council to stay, except for Gibraltar. And they were still looking apparently for the one person in Gibraltar who voted to leave. But it is extraordinary because obviously the council took it quite seriously, or at least they tried to cope with this. So and I remember pretty soon afterwards, there was a lot going on in Brixton. I live very, very close to Brixton. And you would drive down Acre Lane and there would be great big banners sort of attracting you to go to Brixton and do various things there. One banner said, visit our single market, which I thought was quite interesting in itself. And another one said, Brixton means Brixton. And I would drive and laugh my head off each time. And it was there for quite some time. So you can imagine the sort of contempt that we all felt towards this meaningless phrase of Brexit means Brexit. And that, I think, has been the essence of the real problems that we have all had. And it's also interesting what has developed since, because you say in the book, and I'm very pleased to hear that the people who knew what was going on were the civil servants. Now, of course, the civil servants in the UK had never really done a trade deal because it was all happening through Europe. So there was a lot that they had to learn. But by comparison to the politicians, I mean, they knew what they were doing, and you found dealing with them, pretty convincing. But of course, the current government doesn't seem to think very highly of them. We heard about Jacob Rees-Mogg wanting to, reduce the number of civil servants. That plan, by the way, has been abandoned. But nevertheless, a lot of attacks on the civil servants not doing the right thing, not even going in when they work, because they all want to work from home. What are they exactly contributing? But in the book, it is quite obvious that the only people who knew anything about what was going on were the civil servants. Because you do also attack, well, I shouldn't say that, because of course you are still a functionary, but you do say some interesting things about the media. Mm-hmm. And I think what you say is that the influential reporters and columnists in London don't understand the EU at all. Probably they don't speak any of the languages, and they write basically what is fed to them by the Westminster bubble. And that's what they do. Well, if that is the case, then obviously the population here thinks differently too. So things which appear to be a great victory for the UK, or at least sold as a great victory, are not a victory at all. In fact, they were a victory for the EU. And indeed, the unity that you describe is absolutely the thing that has kept it all and made it such a big, sort of clear departure at the end of the day. And talking again about the politicians and how much they knew and understood. One of the pictures you did not show, and you were absolutely astonished, I think, when that happened, when the picture was taken and went viral, is in one of the negotiating meetings, supposedly, David Davis turns up, who was in charge of the whatever it was called, Brexit department, or the department for leaving the EU. And the picture shows Barnier with loads and loads of papers and really, really well briefed on one side of this table. And across the table, David Davis with no papers at all. And of course, it's not terribly surprising, because I remember watching BBC, the sort of Westminster channel. And David Davis was asked in Parliament about this report put together by the civil service, which had looked at the request of the government at all the aspects of the economy and their departments. And they were asked to put a report together on what the implications would be. That report was pretty damning, because it was leaked, so people were able to access it. And David Davis was asked, well, but have you read the report of your own government? He said, well, I didn't bother to read anything economists write, or something like that, which of course adds to the Michael Gove comment. I mean, this country has had enough of experts. So evidence wasn't really listened to. And even during those negotiations, the background that the politicians came with was already fixed in their minds. Now, where are we now? I mean, that should have been the 50th anniversary of us joining the European community, which of course now we have left. This is the third year, of course, of having left properly. But it is also the 10th anniversary of Cameron's Bloomberg speech, which heralded the referendum, which of course led to Brexit at the end of the day, and the issues that we've all suffered since. Now, well, you could say, all right, we have left and we can cope with it, and we still have, relationship with Europe of some sort. But the truth is that the economic implications have been very, very significant. When you look at growth, when you look at trade, when you look at people, when you look at scientific collaboration, all the calculations are that we have already lost in terms of productivity and competitiveness. But finally, the population is beginning to wake up. It's quite recent. The opinion polls now show that the majority of people think it was a mistake. It is extraordinary to think that through years, such an important country was fed misinformation about the whole issue of being members of the EU, and not really focusing on what the single market has to give us. Now, I'm speaking not just as a Remainer or Remainer, or whatever it is that one may be so labeled as, but as an economist who had done quite a lot of work in this area, and quite a lot of work, not just recently. I was one of the first people to work on the Cecchini report, which many of you are too young to have even been born when it was done, which was called The Cost of Non-Europe in the late 80s. So I was responsible for one bit of it. I was a partner at KPMG, and there were other consulting firms that did or looked at particular sectors. And then we put it all together and looked at the implications of this, which were very significant in terms of having a single market because of the benefits it brings eventually to consumers, low prices. They're both short-term direct impacts, and there are also, of course, long-term dynamic impacts. Well, this particular study has been revisited. So I will end with this, and it shows some extraordinary data, and that was just a couple of years ago, where it shows that the single market is found to have increased trade between EU members by 109% on average for goods and 58% for tradable services, way above what a free trade agreement might actually give you, which of course is what we are. Now have this free trade agreement, supposedly, which has reduced our trading intensity in the economy and has reduced our exports and imports to the EU. So those gains were huge. The economic, well, the GDP positives have been really much bigger than we had anticipated. And of course, if anything, with a change in the institutional framework that has taken place after the financial crisis and the dreadful things that happened to places like Greece, we now have a lot more of a basis for growth in Europe by comparison to where the UK is, and hugely greater ability to borrow and invest in places in sectors like green energy than is the case in the UK, which is in danger of being left behind. So the latest opinion polls show not only that the majority of people think that it was a mistake, but also that if they were to vote today, they would vote to stay. Okay.
Okay, just before we come to the audience, both at home and in the theatre here, I just want to put a question. I mean, clearly, as you described it, the EU, in effect, was negotiating, knowing what it wanted. It had agreed what it wanted out of the deal, a deal, where the UK government, for all sorts of obvious reasons, didn't know. Put it at its simplest. They were negotiating something without an end point. Now, that, in a sense, is an easy accusation, but you could argue, I think the case the other way around, that the EU didn't have to put what it was negotiating to 27 legislatures as it went along, whereas the UK did. Now, I'm sure those who support Brexit would see that need, however you think it worked well or badly, as making a point about the UK putting the case for whatever it was trying to negotiate to its legislature in a way the EU didn't have to. And doesn't that get to the core of some of the criticisms made by people who favoured Brexit of the way the EU works?
First, we had a legislator. We have the European Parliament.
Of course, Parliament, but not the individual nation states.
No, not for the withdrawal agreement, and neither in the end for the trade and cooperation agreement. I guess what you're saying is it's more political here than on the Brussels side. I think here it was very different in 2020 when Johnson had a comfortable majority compared to the period before that. So I think we're generalizing a bit too quickly that the UK government was a bit lost in the story. The Johnson government, I think, and David Frost would argue they knew very well what they wanted. The free trade, rather relatively minimal free trade agreement. The problem with that was that we needed enough on fisheries and level playing field in order to be able to agree to. The period before was a very difficult period. And Vicky said, well, Brexit means Brexit is perhaps not the most enlightening motto in the context of where Theresa May had to work, where some of MPs in her party said, we don't want Brexit. And it had some meaning. And so and I would say what the book shows that she constructed that meaning as she went along, basically. The Lancaster House speech was very different from what came out in November 2018 that I briefly just described there behind the lectern. Then, and that's my final point, that the underlying would be what Dominic Raab says in the book, were dogmatic or legalistic and rigid. I think the book takes issue with that, because with Johnson, we negotiated a hard Brexit, and with Theresa May, a somewhat softer version. So we negotiated two different Brexits with two different governments and prime ministers. I think that's not something to be forgotten. When people say we're legalistic and rigid, and I think that defies that point.
Okay, well, actually, I'm going to take a question that relates to this from outside the theatre. So I'm going to take it from somebody at home, but unusually. So Richard Corbett says, that's you, say it was easier to negotiate with Johnson than May, but was that not because he was willing to agree points with no intention of implementing them afterwards, i.e. the Northern Ireland protocol, participation in Erasmus, provision for a security partnership, etc.? Well done, Richard, for getting a laugh from an audience when you're not in the room.
Erasmus suddenly disappeared the very last days. I think I forgot exactly, it was 1 week before that we were all done with Erasmus, with the civil servants. And then the decision was taken, not sure for what reason, that Erasmus wouldn't happen. On common foreign security policy, indeed, we had agreed with Boris Johnson in October 2019 a political declaration on the future relationship, which had a specific chapter on that. That followed from Theresa May's request to have the best possible partnership with the EU compared to any other UK third country relationship in the world. That was the official policy in government papers from Theresa May. And then Johnson Frost said, no, we don't want it any longer. So I think the biggest difficulty during the negotiations was the fact that Theresa May wanted frictionless trade out of the single market and customs union. That is not, and that's why I argued it was easier with David Frost and Boris Johnson in 2020. There were episodes in 2020 with the violation of international law in September 2020, the backtracking on the political declaration. Of course, it was a different government, backtracking on political declaration. Again, not up to me to defend the UK government, but then there was a big difference between Johnson pre-December 19 and post-December 19, because he had a majority. Johnson tried to say in September 2020 will violate international law. I think that was to put pressure on us. No deal, end of June, end of August, by October, no deal, we walk away. That never happened. So that confrontational rhetoric and perhaps also the backtracking on what had been agreed never really impressed us. And we kept them separate, the withdrawal agreement from the future relationship.
But I suppose the point there is that Theresa May thought you could have frictionless trade or take bits of the single market that suited us. And then we'd go in and out, a little bit like what we had done before, get some opt-outs on this and then still be there and have preferential arrangements with the EU. So quite unrealistic. Or what were you doing when she was arguing that that's what she wanted, or she was hoping to get that? I mean, I presume you were telling the officials that there was no point in even discussing it. So how did you get to any conclusion? I mean, I read a little bit about the book, but you were sort of quite surprised about that type of demand.
Well, in phase one we were very, very firm on financial settlement, citizens' right. And if you look what comes out in December 17 from the negotiations, it's the opposite from the Downing Street dinner of April 17. So the UK changed position quite dramatically in those 6-7 months, which was our first negotiation experience, which also was, let's just be patient, let's focus on what we need and what we can do. And I think we could do, as I said, softer or harder Brexit within the limits of a mandate, but always respecting the core principles we had. So in 2018, we, especially on the Northern Irish backstop, which was the UK-wide customs union, that came out of a back and forth, give and take kind of process, where with the level playing field conditions attached to it, we were managed to do that. Problem with later on with Boris Johnson is that he didn't want that kind of obligations on the UK and could therefore not get corresponding benefits.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the room. There can be lots of questions, got lots more online. So let's start with person in blue in the middle there, right in the room, to make it as difficult for the microphone to get to you as possible. I'll come to others, but I'll take them in threes so we get through lots of questions. So try and make them short. I'll come to you. And the start, I won't forget, don't worry, it was equal opportunities up there, don't worry. Yes, please.
You mentioned that.
And so if you'd like to say who you are, sorry to interrupt you, if you'd like to say who you are, do say who you are, but don't feel you've got to.
I'm Charlie Bonhuis. I work for an implementing agency of the Dutch government and study at LSE at the moment. You mentioned that patience had a big role in the negotiations. To what extent was that attitude assumed by the EU, and to what extent by the UK? And could you have negotiated without that patience as a strategy?
Patience. Right, and there was a hand there, and then one right at the back there. Now we'll take these three, and then I promise you I'll come to the audience and to others. Yep.
Hi, I'm Ulysses. I'm a student at the European Institute here at LSE. Guy Verhofstadt, a Renew Europe MEP, said, "I have a dream, Ukraine and Britain joining the EU in the next 5 years." He said that on the 30th of January, so this year, recently. Do you think that's realistic from the EU perspective? As in, would the EU be open, and would the EU want the UK to rejoin the EU in the next 5 years?
And I think I read Michel Barnier quoted the other day in the Telegraph saying that the EU would welcome the UK back at any time. Back there. Sorry, I'm sorry to make you run around with the microphone. It's my fault. Right now, the very back. I'll come to that person next. Okay.
Hello, my name is Danny Hattem. I work here at the LSE. The great villain, quote unquote, of the referendum were the Leavers, I imagine, in the minds of most people here. But I can also see that during the negotiation period, the great villain, quote unquote, were the Remainers. Just how frustrating was it in Brussels to see people who, at all costs, seemed to refuse to engage in the process in the hopes that they could just stop the whole thing?
Paradox indeed. Right. Do you want to have a go at those three?
Yes. It's a great question on patience. It was especially needed when we were confronted with three types of situations: a threat to walk away, a UK which hadn't made up its mind on what it wanted. I quote one ambassador in 2018 that it's hard to negotiate with a country that doesn't know what it wants. And that was in the context of a divided government, a divided Conservative Party in the House of Commons. Some people wanted no deal, others wanted no Brexit. We'll come to that on the Remain side. And what helped us, the unity, of course, made sure we could practice that, but also the clarity of our mandate, I think. There was no way that we could agree to something that violated the core of our mandate. And so as long as that was not there, member states would not basically say, just wait, right? I mean, in the book I described when Johnson came into power, it was like do or die, ditch the backstop, and member states I describe in the book said, well, the only thing we can do is wait. So that's an example of patience, basically, at a crucial time of negotiations. Can't say that it wasn't nerve-wracking at times. Sometimes you get quite nervous when you're patient. Okay. On Guy Verhofstadt and Michel Barnier, a French Gaullist who was quoted in the Daily Telegraph. For what you say, I'm talking here as an author of this book. I'm also an EU official, so I have to be a little bit careful in terms of what I say to that. But what I would say, two things is, one is the EU is changing, obviously. I spoke about an 800 billion borrowing capacity, which is called Next Generation EU post-pandemic. We use the peace facility for funding of national arms to Ukraine. So national deliveries are funded by the EU, partly funded by the EU. So there's greater defense cooperation. There is a lot of happening in the industrial deal, Green Deal. So the EU is evolving as we speak, right? So and deepening with 8, 9 countries wanting to join. Balkans, Ukraine, and some others. So I would also say that we are in a different situation today, and it's not so much about the rejoin, but in terms of the relationship going forward from the period of the book, which is a period of acrimony also, especially until Brexit was done. And that then comes to the Remain question. Robert Peston is on the cover there. The Brexit you'll never hear about from a British negotiator, an important book, but it's also the Brexit you perhaps never hear about from the Remain people that came to see Michel Barnier and found a negotiator who said, well, I'm working for a deal. And that's hence my picture that I showed. So we had people on the Remain side who came to us, and we'll need to read the book to see who that is, but can't you provoke a crisis in UK politics? It could be cathartic, and then we would come perhaps to another referendum, or surely on free movement of people, there is a way out, and we have less free movement of people, but still will be a member somehow, a bit like an extra opt-out or something, or at least some restrictions. And we said that just won't happen. You had your chance with the Cameron settlement. You did a referendum which was in or out. And we were working for a deal. So we were working for Brexit, even though I describe at the very end that we sacrificed a lot in terms of our private time for a project we didn't believe in, but we had to deliver because it was in our interest to have a deal. And so Remain people had to live with that.
Now, Susan Wolf, I hope you can hear us now. We're nearer to the microphone. Send me another message if you can't. I'm going to take three more now. One from Kevin Featherstone of the European Institute, who in different circumstances would have been here this evening. Stefan said it was easier to negotiate with Boris Johnson, but on the Northern Ireland Protocol, we're back to that, didn't he trick you by agreeing to something he didn't really plan to implement, that is no border controls over the Irish Sea? Some might say he lied and got away with it. But I mean, bringing that down to where we are now, though, in a sense, it looks as if perhaps in order to get the final deal, the EU is going to have to soften its position compared with what was in the protocol discussed. So I'll add that to Kevin's other sharp question. And down the front here, there, somebody at the back, I remember vaguely, but. And then I'll come to you. I promise I'm not forgetting you up there. Yes, please.
Thank you. Sheila Page. I've worked on trade agreements in the past. And that actually is a bit the point of my question. It's not quite true that no one in the UK had negotiated a trade agreement. A lot of them had negotiated trade agreements for other people. If instead of having it done in the Brexit department, it had been managed in ODA, they actually would have been a considerable amount of expertise. So my question really is, has the civil service, notably your whole department, learned anything from this? Because it did seem not very good at the nitty-gritty of what anything from rules of origin to actually how you do a trade agreement. It seems to have forgotten about things like movement of musicians, of research, funding, and things like that. I mean, has it learned anything about trying to draw in expertise from the rest of the UK government, or indeed the rest of UK society?
Good question. I'll put that on to Vicky first when we get there. And there's one other on down there. So there's three questions again.
Hi, thank you for your time tonight. So from the outside, it seemed that all the discussions around fishing territories and the fishing industries were quite important and conflictual. My question is, was this true? But also more generally, do you think that all the pain points that gets out into the media are very reflective of the reality? And how does public opinion influence those day-to-day negotiations?
Okay, Vicky, can I take you first this time? I know it's Stefan's book, but the precise point about, let me paraphrase, did the civil service not fail in the way it's sometimes described by Brexiteers, but fail Remainers as well? Did it fail both?
Well, the civil service, of course, I was a civil servant and I worked in the trade department. So, Henry, you've got a point, as you know full well that through the period that we were members of the EU, a lot of the trade deals and negotiations were actually done from Brussels with support. But one hadn't really sat down and agreed a new deal. But of course, every little bit of how the single market was developing was done with all the civil servants working on this and advising. And also, when it came to state aid rules, which are just about to be abolished, it seems, in Europe, we knew how to negotiate with that. And of course, we had all sorts of dealings with Europe on what to do with the financial services and the service sector overall, e-commerce and so on. So there were those issues that were dealt with quite well in the past. But of course, when it comes to changing how you work, you've mentioned the rules of origin, which basically, for those who don't know, it means that the agreement that has been signed requires one to prove that whatever it is that we're selling on the merchandise side is mostly UK, and everything that isn't, because we're no longer members of the customs union, needs to be properly declared. And if the customs the tariffs that we charge are not the same as what the EU charges, we have to adjust for it. So that's roughly how it works. Or if the percentage is acceptable, you still need to prove that that is the case. So you don't have to pay any extra tariffs on this, but you need documentation. So there's all that. plus everything else in terms of ensuring that you've gone through various processes, particularly on agricultural food and sanitary regulations and all that, which increase the cost. So, but those things have added to the complication of it all and have added to the need of businesses to get the advice. Before, on normal export stuff, there was a lot of support that the various agencies that the department was involved in could do. After that, it has become a little bit more difficult because you require those experts. But in addition, the government has gone out to recruit any trade expert they can possibly think of who may have negotiated a trade deal with somebody, some remote island anywhere. And they did that. And they did bring people in. But the interesting thing is that there weren't very many of them around that you can get from outside the EU itself. That can easily come and do the negotiation with Europe, or perhaps help us with any other countries. But we did bring lots of Australians to help us, and a few others. Has the civil service learned a lot from that? Well, we have managed to do loads and loads of trade deals in the last couple of years. Many of them, though, were simply rolling over what the EU already had. We've done some new ones, like with Australia, and we've done them rather badly because basically we've helped those countries rather than necessarily helping our agricultural sector or our fishery sector, which is screaming, saying let down by Brexit.
So Kevin Featherstone's question, is it in a sense the way the protocol was signed? I mean, I'm certainly adding to his point, sort of meaning that in the end, the EU will have to compromise a bit more than it meant to.
Could I just say one thing on civil servants? Because I'm a civil servant, so I have to be careful on your question on today, but it's very hard for civil servants to work for a divided government. What you do as a civil servant, you gain time, you try not to commit. That's what I say in the book. I document in the book February 2018, where I think 4 or 5 members of the Theresa May's government gave speeches on the future relationship, and one contradicted the other. So if you're a civil servant working for that government, that's not an easy job. And so you try to slow down and gain time.
Well, they were deliberately ambiguous to hold the coalition together in the cabinet, weren't they? That's what they were doing.
But people were briefing against each other. I document in the book. And, okay,
sorry.
I described, there are 2 chapters in the book on the negotiations on the protocol on Northern Ireland with Boris Johnson, and 2 on Theresa May. And that chapter is quite, on Johnson's Downing Street operation, quite remarkable for the discrepancy between what was happening in the actual negotiations and what was fed by some people in Downing Street to the media. So there was times when I would look at the UK media with belligerent confrontational rhetoric and leaks as well, on the same day as we had made good progress in the actual talks in Brussels. That has always struck me. And I come back to Vicky's initial points on the media. I think there's at least one in this room, but there's some brilliant journalists who have who understood very well what was happening in these negotiations. So I wouldn't want to make this a general statement on UK media, but I came to know quite a bit of editors also in London, and there were a number of people who didn't understand the EU enough, they told me literally, to play their role as fourth estate and hold the government to account. And there's part of the media where, as I describe again in the book, the pre-existing views on the EU just feed the angle of the news desk, sometimes to the despair of their Brussels correspondents. So the question is quite direct on
yes.
the personality of the Prime Minister. That's not something I feel at liberty. I can't look into his head. I just can document in the book that I think Boris Johnson understood very well the details of what he agreed to in October 19. So people who think he's maybe not a details man, which is what I got as a question, that's certainly not the image that comes out of the book in October 19.
And if we don't fisheries question.
No, well, yes, that's a very good question again. It was very difficult. It was the last issue standing after we concluded level playing field. On the 24th of December 2020, the only issue was fisheries. And partly you have to understand that member states with fishing interests, and they're 5, 6, 7, 8, depending a bit, but for them to agree deliberately to a deal that hurts their fishing industry is not easy. So for some member states, what David Frost was arguing until October 2020 was basically a no-deal situation, because a prime minister or a government leader cannot stand up to his or her fishing community and say, well, we have a good deal with the UK, just not for you. That's not a winning situation. So we had to find a way out, and we did, with quite a bit of give and take on both sides. For us, we have a 6-year transition period where it goes from like 100 to 75, and we have sustained the quota over time. This issue will no doubt come back in 26 in terms of access to waters, but then there's also an issue of access to energy grids, and all that is linked deliberately so in the agreement.
But the question is, if I may, how much was understood about what the implications of this agreement would be? Because I think you have somewhere a quote, and I thought I had underlined all this to ask you, where an expletive was used, which is always nice to see in a book. I can't remember whether it was Johnson or Frost who says, who cares about the mackerel? So dismissing the entire thing as being, you know, not beyond their sort of concerns, but does it mean they didn't understand? Wasn't anyone there who understood anything about fishing?
The book doesn't say, by the way, that David Frost said that. It says there was a tweet which claimed that David Frost said that as an expression of the exasperation on that final day.
Poor mackerel.
Poor mackerel. Right, let's go to the, yes, I said we have people up. So there, and then person here, and then the front.
Yeah, thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm now a broadcaster and writer. I've mainly been doing TV and radio on the war in Ukraine, but I did work in a number of European Union programs as a contractor in Ukraine, including just before and after the Maidan. Much of what I saw from the EU and the EU delegation was not exactly the Entebbe raid of international assistance. My question is on common security and defense and the current war. How do you see the prospects of that leading to better relationships, more effective relationships in those fields, and hopefully spinning over into other issues? I have noticed that many Commission officials, as opposed to member state officials, aren't always comfortable with CSDP issues, and that particularly applies to Germany, which I think is a real issue for the member states and the UK and NATO and the US. Thank you.
Okay. And yes, straight.
Hello, my name is Angeliki. I'm a master's student in development studies at LSE, and I was also kind of lucky to take part in discussions back in 2019 as a trainee at the Embassy of Greece, at the Home Office and the member states. So my question is, what are the key lessons learned from the deal? And my additional question would be, many have drawn upon an EU identity crisis. Taking into consideration persisting voices like Orban, is EU still have to deal with an identity crisis? Has this been overcome? What are your thoughts?
And yeah. Oh, and of course this guy in the front as well. So we'll take 4 this time. I promise. Yeah.
My name is Franco, and I work in trade policy here in London. And my question is for looking into 2024 and 2025. If there were to be a change in UK government, say a Keir Starmer-led government, would that give the possibility to reset trading relations and leave the possibility to fundamentally change the TCA?
So effectively, it's a change government, is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Intriguing question that neither government nor opposition talks about, and at the front here.
Good evening, John Batchelor. Please, when answering, could you speak a bit closer to your microphones? What differences in negotiating style did you observe between Davis, Raab, Buckley, and Frost? Did they always display the skill sets that you would expect of effective negotiators? Did they always stick to the brief, varying as it was given by their parliaments, or was there an element of freelancing or policy making on the hoof? And did you get any indication or notice before the first three of them threw in the towel?
Right. Well, there's a nice easy one for an official who's going back to work for an official organisation. Right, fair enough. Go for it. You start. All right.
So, I will always bring it back to the book if you allow me. So, because as you say, I'm an EU official, but I speak tonight as author of the book, and I'm actually very grateful to the Commission that it allows me to do this as a civil servant in my personal capacity as author. But on common foreign security policy first, clearly the situation today is already different from the initial stages of the post-Brexit Britain, so to say. We tried with David Frost, Boris Johnson, to convince them to, and member states wanted us to convince them to sign up to a common foreign and security policy partnership. We even published a text, even though we said to our member states, look, David Frost doesn't want it, Johnson doesn't want it, there's no point to ask something which the other party doesn't want. It comes back a bit to the negotiation style of approach. Why ask something if the other party says we really don't want that? It has changed in the meantime. If you think about the first months after when Brexit happened, the end of transition period, the EU ambassador here, diplomatic immunity, all of that was a bit of a mini row. The first focus of the UK was certainly to work bilaterally with member states. And then at some point it also changed with Liz Truss, who attended the Common Foreign and Foreign Policy Council, together with Anthony Blinken and other foreign secretaries or ministers of foreign affairs from other countries. So that was already an important change in a way that symbolically expressed that. And then there is the European political community now, which will be hosted also in the UK, first in Moldova in June, and later on Spain, the UK. So that's also an expression of, can we discuss things that are geopolitically, strategically important? So that's outside of the EU structures, but still an important new forum. But it was not for want of trying on our side that we don't have a common foreign and security policy partnership today, or a structured dialogue, or those kind of issues. On the question of lessons learned, and you mentioned Viktor Orban. In the book, Viktor Orban is a strong supporter of EU unity on the Brexit negotiations. And at some point, the UK diplomats tried to work with different countries, and could the unity be broken? That never worked. And I wouldn't also know why any of the 27 EU leaders would have broken the unity for the sake of what? For them. You know, what would be in it for someone to break a unity, which certainly the Franco-German alliance and other countries certainly wanted to maintain, and all countries wanted to maintain, if you look back. The key lesson for me is, if you negotiate, it sounds very trivial, but if you negotiate, know what you want, be clear about what you want. There's no point in confronting the other party and telling the other party, and that was quite remarkable for me sometimes, that negotiators would tell us, you're not asking EU for the right things, you're making the wrong choices, you EU. What you try to do is not in your own interest. UK people would say, British people, negotiators would say, I'm like, this is our position. Like, whether you think this is the choice we collectively made. And so respect the mandate of the other party, but try to work with that mandate. And then to come back to the negotiators, well, we had four. Again, with David Frost, that government knew what it wanted. It was a harder Brexit, perhaps economically more damaging, but that was what the government wanted. And that was therefore within that paradigm of Canada with level playing field conditions. and the fishery issue, which was a complicated one. I think the most difficult part with the previous negotiators, especially the David Davis, Dominic Raab, was that they were part of a government that denied that leaving the single market did have to have a negative economic impact. That was the most difficult part. And then they tried to work with trust, and we no longer have common institutions where you can trust us, UK. Member states trust each other because they have common institutions that make sure that what is agreed is implemented and enforced. And there's a court of justice ultimately to do it if need be, and impose fines even on member states if they don't play by the rules that were agreed. Once you're outside of that structure, trust is not something that works in terms of trade and standards and all those kind of issues. Yeah, I think
so yeah, perhaps just a couple of things, but going back to whether Boris Johnson was not intending to implement anything that he signed.
Question asked that.
Question, yes. Well, what we've seen, interestingly enough, is that we haven't done what we said we were going to do in terms of controls at the border for goods coming in. And certainly we've been delaying them, whereas they do exist at the other side of the channel. We haven't got them here. And we do know that there is, unless it's been withdrawn, there is a legal challenge to the UK, which actually, there's been yet another legal challenge recently in terms of, some of the intentions that we have in relation to regulations that exist here. And there is a concern, and it was in the papers over the weekend, that the EU will make life much more difficult and impose more trade restrictions if we start the burning, if you like, the bonfire of all the regulations that are now in our statute books, which we want to eliminate or get rid of by the end of the year, supposedly. And of course, loads of them have to do with environment and standards for labor and so on. So if those were to happen and the competitive balance sort of changed, if you like, then the EU will reciprocate. What we have seen so far is the EU threatens to, but doesn't actually do it. So it'd be interesting. I mean, I would quite like to hear whether you think that we are indeed moving into that more litigational environment. But on the other hand, we are making some progress supposedly on the Northern Ireland Protocol, so that may help. So that's the one thing. But when it comes to what we might do with an election, we were discussing this before. Would we be, if we were, let's be in dreamland that we decide to go back in and there is some sort of referendum that gets us there or whatever, or at least start considering it. There is a question of, do we join the euro as well? Would that be part of the obligation or not? But also, frankly, so far, our leaders, that includes the Lib Dems, who had been so in favor of another referendum, and that caused them to lose a huge amount of the number of MPs in the election that followed. Everyone is very scared in this country to really, in political party, to say that we will be considering going back in. In fact, if anything, Keir Starmer has reinforced the view that we're not going back and that we just have to make Brexit work better. Now, that may just be to win an election, and things may change after this political will. But the question really is, given that there are so many areas where we haven't got an agreement yet, whether it's in the financial sector, whether it is in the movement of musicians and others, whether it's easier access to students or anything like that, whether it's Horizon, where we still haven't paid the amount of money to get us in, whether really there is, from your experience, the ability to just do a better deal, or whether it's just wishful thinking.
Okay, well, we'll have one more question on that. I'm going to ask another one from outside the room, Anne Corbett, LSE Consulting. Given that Vicky's just mentioned Horizon, your book tells us that negotiators had agreed continued UK access to the Erasmus programme. What was the EU reaction when you learned that, one, the UK government then turned the deal down, and two, that it already had its own mobility programme, Turing, ready for launching?
Well, yes, we were ready. The initial ask from the UK was, could we stay in Erasmus for half of the period? Which we said, no, either you're in it or you're not in it. So it's the whole period till the end of 27. And then we negotiated the details of that deal, and someone pulled the plug at the last minute. So
Someone.
Well, Downing Street, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, I would think, yeah, but or at least with his approval, obviously with his approval.
Did you get any sense of why they pulled it?
It's hard for me to say. Maybe it was an issue of political symbolism in there. Erasmus is a kind of symbol of Europeanness, or I don't know if that was part of it. It's for me, the questions I can only from the receiving end say we were ready to give it. We had negotiated it, and basically it takes two to tango, as they say.
Okay, that's it, right? Okay, now okay, there's more questions in the audience. Actually, let's take one there and one here. Take three again. Three, yes.
Thank you. Hi, Stefan. I'm Chris Morris. I was a BBC journalist based in Brussels for a long time, and then covering the events the book describes.
You mentioned it, yeah.
Stefan, I'm going to take you back to the issue of Boris Johnson, if I may, and please do answer this question as the author of the book rather than as a somewhat cautious EU official. You said, it's an intriguing thing you said, that he understood the fact that there are trade-offs involved in leaving the single market, and yet his public position was to pretend that those trade-offs didn't exist. So he said there'd be no checks on goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, not what his own deal says. He said there would be no non-tariff barriers between the EU and the UK, clearly untrue under the terms of his own deal. And yet you say that he understood the details, so something doesn't quite add up. Are you saying that he said very different things in private than he did in public? And also, how did senior EU leaders that you worked for react when they heard him began to sell the deal in public in terms that didn't quite correspond with reality?
Well, there we are. Evidence we needed that journalists make better inquisitors than academics. Thank you for that. Very good. And in the middle here. Yes, so right in the middle, and then cut there.
Sorry to be poorly seated for the microphone. I'm Christian. I'm a German MPA student here at the School of Public Policy. I'd be interested to know how the position of the EU Commission developed over time, seeing how the debate evolved in the UK. Especially after the mandate was established, I still observe the debate in Europe as torn between we need to set an example that it can't be beneficial to you to leave the EU, and others that wanted to leave the relations in good shape. Given that, at least it appeared to me that the UK tried to fool a little bit around, maybe with the EU. Did that kind of change the perception towards maybe having a harder deal done towards setting more kind of an example?
And over there, and then.
Oh, hi. Bob Hewlett here. I'm a retired cab driver, so that's why I'm going to apologise in advance if I stop, start and go all over the place. I think you've been very, very kind to our negotiators, and I think Vicky was very kind to our list of Tory prime ministers, because to me, they did sound like the rejects from character rejects from Trump's and fire crew. But with the UK negotiating team, I think you're on the EU side. The influences were the sort of ABC of Adenauer, Esch, and to some extent Churchill. And on the UK side, I think the UK influences were really the BBC, which was Blyton, Biggles, and Colonel Blimp. On a serious question, I'd like to know, with us coming out of Interpol and the police security bodies, how dangerous is Britain going to become as a sort of offshore haven for organised crime? And does the EU perceive that as a threat or possible threat?
Okay. And then I'm going to take one here, and then one up in the, and then another one right then. That'll have to be it. So okay, very good. We'll be spared.
Hi, I'm Marco. I'm a master's student here at the European Institute at LSE. I have a question about what kind of negotiation relationship you developed with Boris Johnson's negotiating team. Were they acting like tough negotiators, or like did they have a tough attitude in general? Was the interaction tense? And if that's the case, what impact did this have on the final outcome of the negotiation? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll get two up in the circle. Yep.
Thank you. Christopher Prentice, former British diplomat. Could I ask you to go back to the earlier stage in the negotiations, to the point of the triggering of Article 51, and that is sometimes identified as the fundamental first error, tactical error, putting all the pressure on the British side, having launched a 2-year process with no idea of what you wanted to get out of it or what your position was. Had sense prevailed and that government not triggered Article 51 until they had decided what a British position was, what would have happened? How would we still be in some hellish circle of having voted to go out, but never having got even into the negotiation?
Almost answered your own question there, but that's good. And yeah, then that might be the last one.
Hello, I'm Andrew Lone, I'm a lawyer. Given that there are so many aspects of the deal we've negotiated with the EU that have yet to finally land, Northern Ireland, fishing, visas to enter the EU, and so on, have we in fact got Brexit done? And indeed, what further needs to be done to actually get Brexit done? Where will it land?
It's an interesting question, because I'm certainly reading a number of pro-Brexit commentators recently. They've definitely sort of detached the idea of leaving the European Union from getting Brexit done, which I think is an interesting further iteration.
Sorry, I had asked that.
Stefan.
My point of view, what I had asked earlier, but it's more or less the same question, is that perhaps that is what Keir Starmer thinks he might be able to achieve, and or it may all be achieved before that, of course. And and whether it's doable is the real question. What does it actually mean? What does it require for that to happen? So
there's a lot there.
Yes, there is a lot. It seems to me that Brexit is a word with many different meanings, right? Yes. The subtitle is "How do you got Brexit done?" which is a bit cheeky, but it's basically, say, well, we never wanted to sabotage the project, unlike what some media or even political advisors in this country were saying. But you're right that there's a review clause. There is a 2026 energy/fisheries issue. There are sunset clauses to adequacy and equivalence agreements. You refer to migration issues. There is a lot there. And it seems to me that, that the UK, as such a close third country, will always have to come to an understanding and see what it wants to basically perhaps ask from the EU, which brings me a bit to speculative questions. I'm not going to enter too much, but there's two things I want to say on future. One is we fought hard against what David Frost and Johnson wanted to have this, when it gets very nerdy for a second, this overarching governance agreement, which is basically a partnership council, which says we can also have supplementing agreements and you plug them in there. It's like a plug and play kind of thing. So, but before people get too excited, of course, it will have to be also in the EU's interest. And what I write in the book, the defense of the EU's interest, is certainly something which will continue guiding the EU. And it is in the EU's interest to have a closer and better relationship. But we will need to see what kind of terms member states will want to define on that. I'm taking them in the reverse order, perhaps. So Tactical error, Article 50. My argument in the book, it has been made as an argument by people that said we should have taken more time, perhaps sound out capitals. None of the capitals wanted to talk to the British government before the letter had been sent, because the letter is a formal act under the treaty to leave the EU. So was there perhaps a better process possible within the UK on what do we want from this? What does it mean 52% want to leave? Can we have our cake and eat it in terms of my policy is pro having cake and pro eating it, is come back to Boris Johnson, what he said to the BBC, I think, to Laura Kunzberg, from what I recall. So was that, I would say, from the EU side, we were waiting for the letter. Whether a different process had been possible here, possibly. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight in the book, we say Theresa May's first speeches were about a hard Brexit, and what came out of the process was not exactly that. But by that time, she had certainly raised expectations with some MPs and what she was trying to deliver, certainly.
But you did say there in the book on that one, before you leave, that the fact that from triggering it, you had sort of 2 years. Yes, there could be a transition period, possibly, actually was to the disbenefit of the Brits in terms of the negotiating. So because all the cards were with you.
But the clock is ticking, as we used to say, and that's something which goes back to Giscard d'Estaing, the changes of the treaty. I mean, I remember that Nigel Farage was saying at that time when Article 50 was introduced, we need some kind of ticking clock because we can't be a prisoner forever of never-ending negotiations. Ticking clock is fine, but of course, in terms of your first point of power imbalance in the negotiation, the patience was clearly on our side. Also, the huge agenda for the UK in terms of negotiating Brexit, preparing domestically, talking to third countries about post-Brexit trade deals. It was an enormous agenda, obviously, too. On security cooperation, it's less good than as an EU member, obviously, but there is a decent amount of security cooperation underpinned by the Convention of Human Rights as a issue of compliance and finding the right balance between the state and security and protecting people's rights. But that's in there. It's not real-time database access compared to what the UK asked, but there is some other mechanism to get access, a bit more cumbersome. I'm going a bit quickly here, but setting an example is not what we try to do, I think. I mean, it's just a natural fact of Brexit that you have less benefits and less obligations because you want more sovereignty or take back control of sovereignty. So I wouldn't say that as setting an example, it's just the act of Brexit itself leads to diminished benefits and diminished obligations. So in terms of the question from the German MBA student, I think that's basically what I would say to setting an example. Did our negotiating position develop over time more in 2020 than before, I would say? Because before we were sticking to the withdrawal agreement and the withdrawal issues. On the future relationship, there was more give and take on level playing field. It wasn't exactly what our mandate said. It is more complex. A number of issues we wanted have not been achieved. There was a bit of give and take there with on stay dates and other issues, but the core of what we wanted has been put in there. Also in terms of enforcement, which was a crucial point for us. Enforcement domestically as well by UK courts. And then the final one is on yes, never praise a journalist in public, you get a difficult question. It's hard for me to comment on, you know, I can only say, look at the command paper or the Greenwich speech of Boris Johnson in February 2020 was the start of the relationships on the future. And what came out, David Frost said, I realize this is a short-term adjustment cost for us as a country in Brexit. So he realized there were trade obstacles in what he was trying to negotiate. And he believed in that. So that's basically the model he believed in. And he was Johnson's negotiator. So what I can say is that we never took the no deal threat seriously. Well, we took them seriously, but it wouldn't change our mandate. Let's put it like that. And so we were focused on what we wanted. And if we had, and we agreed to revise Northern Irish Protocol, detailed, the book details that step by step, how Boris Johnson in Manchester Tory party conference gave her a few extra things, step by step, we came to an understanding in exchange for the consent vote by the Northern Irish Legislative Assembly members.
Okay, we're just past 8, but you know, there's a tradition in certainly in British sort of political comment programs to have a jolly question at the end. It's a serious question, as well as one that I think will make people sort of smile. And actually, although it comes from the vice chair of the European movement in the UK, I suspect many on the Brexit side would be interested in knowing the answer to this question as well. Do you think that negotiating the UK's re-entry into the EU will be easier or harder than the negotiations for the UK to leave the EU?
There's no ticking clock.
There's no ticking clock. That's the answer to it. But, and.
It's, I think first, and let's come back to the question from the gentleman up there. When the letter came to us, for us, Brexit was a reality. We turned the page, regrettably, but we managed it. When I still follow, and I still follow UK media, I still keep reading about Remainers and Brexiters.
It's a more powerful identity than Labour or Conservative,
well,
according to political science.
But, well, okay, I believe political science. I was once one by training, so I'm still one, I guess. But for me, there seems to be first the necessary debate here on what that means, and get over that distinction that apparently is a strong identity, as you say. Because then, yeah, I think that's a precondition for any process to be healthy.
And Vicky, do you think if stress if because you know both sides are thinking about this, whether you know those who want to ensure the UK is less likely to, and those who would like to rejoin, if such a thing were on the table. How do you think it would play out?
Well, what we saw in the referendum itself is that economics didn't really play the big part that we all hoped it would. But now economics is getting into the debate a bit more, because everyone can see what the implications of this have been. Now, of course, we had COVID, we had the energy, the war in Ukraine, what it meant for the energy prices and so on. So you can't quite separate it. But there is a lot of evidence that we're suffering long-term decline in the economy by comparison to others. So it really would depend, therefore, people's livelihoods, productivity, which has really suffered quite significantly already, trade, so jobs and quality of jobs and pay for those jobs. Is something which I think might determine at the end of the day what people really think about being prepared to go through this process of rethinking, rejoining. And as I said, the polls are changing. There's no doubt that they are changing. Whether there is enough, there will be enough political will to do something about it. And whether, of course, how Europe would react. Because I read from your book that as far as you're concerned, Europe is concerned, Brexit is done, and you've got loads of other things to think about rather than having to deal with those difficult Brits who make life, harder for you.
And we have 9 countries already that want to join.
That's true. Another
so we have
General de Gaulle, after all, got there ahead of everybody on that subject. I think it's just also worth adding that though the polling has shifted substantially, people are still a bit about another referendum. If it came to that, they're much more sceptical about the horrors unleashed by the referendum, or at least the sort of near culture war issue that I think that turned into. So anyway, we'll see. Look, thank you all for all your questions and those online. I'm sorry, everybody online, I didn't get to all your questions, but thank you all for joining us. There will now be an opportunity to buy a copy of the book and come up and have it signed, should you so desire. So I'd just like to thank Vicky Price and Stefaan De Rynck and all of you for what's been a fascinating meeting. Thank you.